This is the Enragé, a show where we take a deeper dive into written works published at the Center for a Stateless Society. Join us as we give voice to the ideas challenging the vain phantoms that haunt our social reality and stand in the way of total liberation. For more information, visit c4ss.org. And to support this show or any of the other projects happening at the Center, please visit patreon.com/c4ss.org. Thank you for listening. Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the 13th episode of The Enragé. I'm your host, Joel Williamson, and today we'll be joined by William Gillis to discuss their article titled Bad People, Irredeemable Individuals and Structural Incentives. William Gillis is a second-generation anarchist, lapsed physicist, and transhumanist who's been interested in the egalitarian potential of markets since 2003. Will is the former lead coordinator of C4SS, whose writings can be found at the Center, as well as humaniterations.net. Will, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
Yeah, absolutely. How's it going?
It's going pretty good.
Cool. So we brought you on because you wrote an article not that long ago. How long ago did you write this, actually?
Actually, I wrote it at the tail of the uprising, so this would have been 2020. I just haven't written that much since then. There wasn't long-form book reviews. So this is probably the last thing that I wrote before a series of reviews and minor articles.
Yeah. Could you please give the audience a brief overview of the article and why you decided to write it?
Sure. So the article is kind of like a bit of a rambling structure, but I was trying to cover a lot of things that I think are central issues in politics today, more broadly, the anarchist movement, anarchist ethics, and things that consistently come up in conversations and discussions and in struggles where we haven't done a good job of formalizing or making explicit. So it discusses basically the problem of people who can't be easily taken off a path of misbehavior. So people who are predatory, abusive, inclined to selfishly hurt other people for their own benefit or for no one's benefit, and what the implications of the existence of those people are, and something of a corrective of some popular anarchist tendencies to write off the existence of people who in no pragmatic period of time can be dissuaded or have their values changed, at the very least. People whose motivation is not in line with anarchist values, but who you're not going to be able to change those perspectives, those motivations without decades, vast personal changes, implausible things, or huge amounts of energy expenditure. And so part of the reason why it was written during the tail end of the uprising here in Portland is that a lot of conversation had come up with regards to police and ACAB. And I wanted to emphasize and talk about the consequences of abolitionism when it comes to, the existence of the police, and that the police aren't bad merely because of structural forces. Individual police, individual cops are bad for a vast variety of reasons. And the structure, the framing context of the police institutions themselves merely provide a site for them to accumulate, a site for them to mobilize, to have different institutional incentives and things along those lines. But these people are going to exist no matter what. And there was a lot of talk during the uprising that either reduced the content of ACAB, all cops are bastards, to they're merely that because of their structural role. If they took off that badge, they could be a good person, which in many cases is naive. But in general, there was a lack of understanding of the tensions and the possibilities and the constraint on the possibility space of dealing with the police. And the other direction that people would go in is saying, okay, well, we should exterminate all the police. 700,000 people in the United States are enrolled in some way directly as in police institutions. And that's a very limited definition of police, right? Badge holders, not necessarily every other institution or job that functions as police. So we might say that, like, teachers function as police in some ways. We might say that social workers function as police in some ways. But if we're just constraining the definition of police to, actual badge wielding, classically who we would think of as police, it's still like 700,000 people in the United States. And there was another tendency, beside the one that was just like, if we remove the badge from the individual will turn out great or won't be a problem anymore. Or somehow like social conditions and broader social paradigms will shift in such a way that the individual just like reshapes themselves. Or, come future generations, there simply won't be anyone born remotely like the sort of people that were attracted towards the institution and the role of policing. So the other tendency was to just say, let's kill 700,000 people. Let's just exterminate them, right? And I think that's so deeply abhorrent and not in line with anarchist values that I wanted to write something that could try to make this tension or this issue more explicit and work through it, or allow people to kind of read through the general tensions in a way that doesn't lead to an exterminationist conclusion. If you were going to remove people who are functionally police, and I'm happy to concede that, many social workers and teachers and whatever, many roles that function as police currently, I'm happy to admit that, like, those folks probably are not motivated, didn't grab those roles necessarily for the pursuit of power and abuse and, doing harm to other and feeling big or whatever. I'm happy to admit that, like, many of those people would probably at least be far better where certain structural things changed. But I also think that the 700,000 people who are occupy the role of cops today, that they're only the tip of a much larger iceberg. The title of the essay, Bad People, is an intentional kind of like reduction, right? Like I wanted to use a term that people, or a phrase that people would find particularly obtuse or straightforward or simplistic, to try to address the issue at a nuts and bolts level and kind of provoke a certain response about like essentialism. But the 700,000 people that we would have to exterminate, if we were going to exterminate all the bad people or whatever, or all the cops, that number is actually much larger, because there's a vast variety of people who are very close in core motivation and locked in sort of framework and strategies and interaction with the world. And those 700,000 people, we're talking about, gangsters, people who murder for sport, people who, are serial abusers in like grotesque and horrific way. Like I think the number of people who we might categorize as deeply wedded to malicious strategies and values is much, much larger than just the expanse of police. And so I think it's really important to evaluate exactly the problem and not just wipe it off as in the vein of utopianism that anarchists are oftentimes accused of, and that many of us have increasingly fallen into over the 20th century and the early 21st, into thinking that it's simply a matter of changing the structural dynamics, and then there will not be such instances of individual maliciousness. I think it's important to counter that, but it's also important to really grapple with, like, what are the alternatives besides extermination? And so that's kind of like what the overall piece does. And so it dips back and forth from talking about police, talking about game theory, talking about abuse and rape and instances a lot like that within the anarchist community and the struggles that people have had with that kind of thing, to try to make broader points.
Got it. Well, that's going to transition pretty smoothly into this next question. When first hearing about police abolition or anarchy as a political philosophy, some people have a knee-jerk reaction that anarchists are just naive dreamers who simply have an unrealistic amount of faith in humanity. And toward the beginning of your article, you wrote how even in, quote, the most harmonious and enlightened community, in the most advanced culture, in the most egalitarian and fair world, there will still emerge the cruel and callous, the manipulative and brutal. Why do you support bringing about a stateless society if you don't have faith in the inherent goodness of people?
Well, there's an old joke, not really a joke, although we oftentimes phrase it as one, that there are two sorts of anarchists. There are anarchists who believe that humans are angels or would be naturally, and so the state only interferes with that and constrains us and warps us from our nature. And then there are people who think that, or there are anarchists who think that people are pretty shitty, and so the state only magnifies the amount of shittiness that they can get up to. And I don't know that I would peg myself strongly in either of those camps, but I think that the latter, the people are pretty shitty or can be pretty shitty direction, is one that we don't often air. Although I hear it very frequently from a lot of people on the ground in anarchist practice spaces, communities, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that motivates a lot of people who do come over to the anarchist position, not just the other one, at least initially. But we don't tend to like drill into what that actually implies. So it's not just a matter, though, of like bad people can get up to sometimes greater scales of badness through the structures of the state, and that the state can magnify the impact, the harm. It can also like lock in certain structures of badness. The state is kind of a trap that we can work our way into and then find it very hard to change social relations to get out of it, right? Because the state is a reinforcing structure or reinforcing a state of affairs. But it's not just that. Like, I don't fight for an anarchist society because I think people are good or because I think people are bad. I fight for a freer world because I value other people and I value the agency that they have. I value their creativity, their capacity for choice. And those are kind of my core values. And the application of that necessarily means providing people with agency, providing people with more options, trying to stoke spaces for positive sum interactions, that kind of thing. And, you know, I don't think that people are necessarily by means of biology born one way or the other, but I do think that there are certain strategies or certain tendencies, certain perspectives that do consistently emerge, both for the better and for the worse, in bodies of people. And those strategies we have to like recognize will in some way always be present. And I think that the worst, again, to use the reductive language of the article, bad people will oftentimes see the world purely in terms of power relations, right? So there's no escape from power. There's no escape from lines of domination. Everything is just one line of domination, or, you know, complex, multifaceted lines of domination between, you know, vast networks of people, individuals. And there's no escape from that. And so anyone who thinks that there is an alternative is basically like a naive fool, a sheep to be led to the slaughter, somebody making a mistake. And one thing that I wanted to emphasize in the article is that that perspective is itself a mistake. There is a certain strength, and there are a great multitude of reasons why what we might call good perspectives, again, you know, to kind of delight with the simplicity of good and bad in this. There are other things within strategies, values, motivations that we might call good. And the emergence of people in varying degrees and shades and colors of good is something that is not just a mistake. It's kind of an inherency. And I didn't get into, you know, all the reasons and all the justifications and all the mechanisms by which what we might call good perspectives emerge. But I did try to emphasize how good strategies in response to bad strategies or other things have a certain potency themselves. And so I think the struggle for a freer, more liberatory world is a struggle to maximize some of the strategies and to make viral some of the strategies that provide more options for people, that reduce or impede the capacity to dominate other people, and that disincentivize bad strategies. And that disincentivization is a complex space. There are certainly bad ways to disincentivize, you know, certain shitty strategies in life and in our relationships with one another. But there are better strategies to do that. And I will also say, I mean, you were asking, like, bringing about a stateless society. Like, I see anarchism as so much more broad than just statelessness.
Mm-hmm.
Our pursuit is, you know, the liberation of all, the freedom of all. And that involves a vast variety of issues and arenas and considerations that extend far beyond the formal boundaries of the state, far beyond the formal boundaries of something we might call capitalism or any number of other things along those lines, beyond patriarchy, beyond, I mean, we can start listing these certain like macroscopic patterns and tendencies, and we could be here all day. I think that what anarchism fights for is beyond just opposing any limited finite list of those. It's about opposing all of the different variations of power. And that's one of the reasons why anarchists will probably always be, in some sense, a minority, because we give people kind of no place of retreat, right? Oh, so you're saying I don't get to like be abusive and controlling in this way. Well, how about I seek power in a different way? And inevitably we have to respond like, no, we're not pro that either. And we're going to try to find ways to counter you in gaining control of other people, constraining their options to build your own or just to constrain the options of others. We're going to try to like stop that no matter what. And so the struggle for statelessness is just the tiniest component of the struggle that I see the Anarchist Project as being.
Of course.
And so in a very real way, that struggle will never be done. And so there isn't, for me, this endpoint where we've checked all the check boxes and we've achieved anarchy, right? Anarchy in perfect fruition is done. I see the anarchist struggle as a perpetually ongoing struggle, even if we accomplish massive things. Cis heteropatriarchy no longer exists. There's no racism. We've accomplished all these things. And yet I would still see that struggle as a struggle that will always kind of be a minoritarian push, or, maybe it could be something that a much larger number of people find themselves deeply committed to and proactively involved in on a daily basis. But there will always be more to be done. So I just kind of wanted to push back a little against the framing of like bringing about a stateless society as an angle.
Yeah. I was going to dip out after universal basic income happened.
I mean, it sounds good to me, right? Just play video games all day after that point. We're good.
So you pointed out earlier that leftists are quick to point out that all cops are bastards because of their institutional function. And you argue that viewing policing solely through this macroscopic lens misses another way in which cops are monsters, namely that the police are rotten because policing attracts rot. Could you elaborate on exactly why this is important to understand?
Well, I feel like I covered some of this already in the sense that, like, if you abolish the police as an institution, you're left with the individuals who still have the motivations. And the strategies, somebody, and it's important to pick apart here. Like, I've said both motivations and strategies here, but there can be individual cops who on paper or in their own self like narrative, their motivations are good, right? They're like, so for example, one of our parents was wildly abusive, and one of my sisters wanted to join child services basically as a cop in order to protect children from abusive parents. And rather correctly, the rest of my family told her, if you do that, we'll renounce you and disown you. So you should probably think about not doing that. But I think that like that motivation, and I'll say I had another friend in high school who was attracted towards becoming a member of the cops. And actually his story might be illustrative. So Kevin was, he was poor, came up in a poor family. He was mixed race, and his father was abusive and dipped out. His mother raised him alone and then had a stepfather. Stepfather was crazy abusive, just off the charts, out of control. And Kevin was a big, burly, very like macho kind of character, very nerdy, but he tried to like hide some of his more less conventionally masculine tendencies. I remember I ran into Kevin in middle school, and he was like drawing swords and knights and armor and then showing porn to the girls to harass them, and just generally being kind of, that kind of kid. Today we would imagine that sort of kid as like on the on-ramp to the alt-right. But one thing that I'll give to my friend Kevin back then was that he may have publicly leaned into the total asshole kind of like quasi-fascist personality, but he was really sincerely motivated. He wanted to stop people like his stepfather, right? He wanted there to be no more people like his stepfather. He wanted to like save people from the pain that he had gone through. And he oftentimes would wear the mask of more conservative or reactionary politics as kind of a defensive mechanism, or as like a shucks, like, this is kind of my like jokester role that I play, as like the jester among people. And gradually we managed to shift him out of a lot of his like, his harassment of women, his like patriarchal shit, and like get him to like integrate better with our broader like friend group network sort of stuff, and like stop being such a prick to people and tone down his reactionary politics. But he went off and he joined the Portland police. And of course, a number of us being anarchists and stuff like that, there were tensions over this. But he went off and he joined the Portland police, intending to protect people, intending to be the figure that could have stepped in and saved him from his stepfather. And, I think that his motivations in that regard were a lot better than a lot of the other motivations of people that join the police. And I can get into that in a second, but I think also it's important to note that the strategies for survival that he had picked up were themselves, as I said, reactionary. And they were strategies about personal strength and, callousness and that kind of thing. They were strategies that avoided empathy and engagement and analysis of complexity. And I like to kind of like put all those things under the broader umbrella of engagement, active engagement with the world around you, not just dominating it or walling it off, but engaging with it. And so this friend of mine from childhood or whatever didn't really go on that path. He went on the path of trying to fit a mold of what strength was, a mold of resisting what he thought weakness was. And so the strategies compounded and built up in a variety of different ways, and that ultimately led to him being attracted towards becoming a member of the police. But he did at the same time have a very kind of explicit, even if like deeply hidden, idealism about the role that he was going to take. And so, he goes through training, he comes up through the ranks of the cadets and everything, I forget exactly what the structures was, and he's like riding around in squad cars. It's funny because our crew was doing a thing one time and he pulled up in a squad car and we were like so fucking terrified that we were going to get like nabbed for some very illegal activity. And Kevin comes out and laughs and we're like, Jesus fucking Christ. And he let us, get away with what we were doing. And so, this is kind of the weird contested thing of being in high school and having this former friend or this person that you've known for a long time join the ranks of the, military occupying army that brutalizes and terrorizes the population. And I'm not saying that, you should stay friends with somebody who does that sort of thing, but I'm trying to explain like how I had known Kevin for so long. Well, Kevin ended up leaving the Portland police, and not after that long. And, he gave a lot of anecdotes about the internal culture of the Portland police.
Wow.
What those individuals had been like, his own experience of it. And one aspect of it was basically, the main reason why he ended up leaving was that despite all his attempts to, posture as being this uber, like reactionary, like super strong macho man, doesn't care, feed the homeless into the meat shredders, kind of thing that he tried to do around his fellow recruits, he was in some inextricable sense ultimately kind of a lib. And I don't mean, I'm not suggesting that liberalism is like this great thing, but it's not quite as fash as like the standard of the police. So there was this training, and at this training, Kevin, he had started to like, because he was kind of sincere, some of the upper brass, and because he was kind of intelligent despite his attempts to hide that, some of the upper brass had started to realize that he was like an up and coming potential recruit for higher office, and that he could become like a part of the upper brass, and that they could use him as like a token, because again, he was Japanese and Mexican and German. they could use him as a token, but they also kind of liked that he had more of their culture and less of the frat boy culture of the rank and file, the beat officers, etc. And he knew, of course, that this was kind of like social death to be considered like part of like the upper brass in that way, or it wasn't like, if not social death, it wasn't it wasn't like a great thing to make friends with, right? Like the officers think I'm a great nerd, and then I'll make captains soon, or some shit like that. So there were already kind of those tensions in the background, and I guess that's kind of important to frame. But at one training one day, he he asked a clarifying question because they're demonstrating something. And this clarifying question is completely just like he asks out of the blue, not as like a gotcha or as like trying to stand up for what's right or anything along those lines, but just because he's still trapped in the framework of the liberal justification for the state, right? He doesn't really understand the raw power game, or he's not fully bought into police as just we're the dominant gang. We win, the other gangs lose. We rule this city. He's not entirely wrapped in that frame of mind. So he asked the clarifying question, don't you have to read them their Miranda rights first? And as he leaves the precinct that night, he gets jumped by a bunch of his fellow cadets or recruits or whatever. And he gets put in the hospital.
Shit.
Yeah, and like really fucked up badly. Like it takes him months and months and months to like unbreak to have his bones heal and as they beat the shit out of him, they call him a dirty hippie. And I've really tried to emphasize, like, Kevin leaned into explicitly reactionary politics. He loved the kind of like the edgelord appeal of being like, oh, we should just have the homeless all fight each other, and the one that survives, we give them a house, right? Like he loved to like lean into that shit, and that's part of the reason why the gulf between us had grown significantly from the period where we thought we had kind of redeemed him from his initial reactionary politics or reactionary inclinations. But that was his character. That was the pretense of masculinity that he loved to put on and wear. And I'm certain that he wore that all the more, in his interactions with other cops, to try to hide that he actually did ultimately, at the end of the day, want to try to protect kids from abusive stepfathers, or abusive people in that kind of role. And that was his main motivation. And he tried to hide that, and he couldn't, right? They smelled it on him. They smelled the lib hippie on him. And so you get jumped by everyone who's in your class coming in, and you realize you're not going to survive in the police. You're not going to survive in the PPB. And so he leaves, just immediately like drops out. And, he had rest of his life and stuff is interesting, and kind of a complex thing we haven't talked in a lot of years. But, after he scrubbed out and he gave a lot of detail and dirt upon like what you might call the office culture of the Portland Police Bureau was like. And, the racism you would expect, right? And the kind of callousness about it. But, it's important to note that like the color blue shines strongest. Like you respect your fellow gang members to some extent, even if you constantly like rib them by using the N-word at them, right? Like, and so there's all these different things. He also gave us a lot of strategic details when he ended up dishing on a lot of his experiences there. Like, I think it was the first time that we'd gotten confirmation that like, in fact, the officers who would come out to protest were always the same officers for reasons, or for this specific set of reasons. So you get overtime for doing protest work, et cetera. We kind of knew that, but there was this office culture of like, there's the gang within the gang. There's the gang of the people who do the protest duty, and they have their own kind of like culture and community and that kind of thing. And if you can get appointed as like one of the like, let's put this diversity like hire the lesbian whatever bike cop. She's going to go out there and be like the person who talks to the protesters. And that doesn't make you like a member of the gang, right? Like you have to choose and get like inducted and like, kind of this other stuff into the gang. And then it's all that entire, like, they're all like, let's go out there and kill hippies, right? Like, let's do it. Oh man, I love bashing hippies skull. When do we get to bash hippies? Right? Like, And so regardless of what the group were that were doing the protest, or I mean, probably they wouldn't act that way if it was fascists or like, you know, anti-vaxxer or like truck convoys or whatever. But like they could smell what a hippie was, right? Like the hippie were the people that like were whining about fairness or caring about other people or any of these other things. Like they could smell what the enemy was, right? And their whole culture was built around like destroying the enemy. Now, so sorry, it's a very long anecdote, but I think it's important to turn that back and be like, well, you know, if you remove the police structure, you remove a number of incentivization things that and coordination dynamics that apply those people, but those people are not going to turn on a dime, to say the very least, and change their values and their core motivations. It's not just for a lot of these people the bad strategies they've fallen into. It's actually just like core personal motivation and values. And they can tell or they can smell, you know, when somebody comes in and has all the bad strategies, all the abusive strategies, but also doesn't have like necessarily the core motivations. And I'm not saying that somebody scrubs out and has like good motivations and bad strategies, that person's going to change their strategies. A lot of people are so deeply locked in how they've learned to deal and engage with the world around them. They're not going to break out of that. No amount of therapy or whatever is going to necessarily change that. But there is this additional dynamic or this deeper thing where if your core values, your core motivations in life are to do harm to other people because you get off on it or whatever, like that's not going to change because like of an accountability process, right? Like there's an anarchist revolution and then we take the cops one by one into like a drum circle and have them read a couple bell hooks essays. They're not going to fucking change. They're not going to become different people. And, you know, we can look at like, you know, obviously there are many things that can be said about the broader context of like imperialist like horrors and the invasion of Iraq, but it is illustrative that the U.S. government, you know, removed all the Baathists from power, all of Saddam's all the people who gravitated towards a certain amount of power and cruelty and control and domination within Saddam's regime, just kicked them out of power, and then didn't have any plan for what to do with them. You know, and that obviously can't be as tepid as sit them in a drum circle and have them read bell hooks, but it also can't be exterminate them all, right? And doing nothing with them, let them basically form terrorist groups and cause all kinds of horrific oppression and atrocities across Iraq, right? Because they couldn't do it through the state. So the gangs that had been the police simply moved to policing in a different way. They became terrorists, right? And continued the horror and the violence and the atrocities in a non-state form. Although we can quibble over exactly how much a terrorist group, like, you know, certain groups are truly outside the state or a non-state thing, because you could say that like Al-Qaeda is a state unto itself in certain definitions. But the point being that like you can't just remove these people from the institution and pretend as though like they're not going to reproduce certain behaviors. Sorry, that's a really long and I feel still not yet sufficient summary of all the things going on there, but I think that answers your question.
Yeah, sure. So it's the case that the thin blue line could smell the empathy in your friend who is essentially a closeted hippie at heart.
God, I don't know that I would call him a closeted hippie. I don't think he was
a
that
closeted
good,
lib,
right? And I will also say, like, not my friend, right? Like,
I'm sorry, yeah,
yeah. Like, especially even at that point, like, you join the cops, but you know, like, certainly, like, somebody had a lot of experience and personal connection,
yeah.
And I would say, like, he had some stray aspects of care about other people and belief in fairness or some idealism to some extent. However fucking, like, covered in reactionary garbage and misperceptions and bad strategies.
But even he, like, with all of his reactionary like baggage that he would spew all the time, even he was in some ways too empathic to join the Thin Blue Line gang. Yeah. Right, which speaks volumes. Yeah. But I mean, like, you know what? The reason I bring that up, and sorry to say he was your friend, but the reason I bring that up, right, it is because I mean, what do you say to people who think that damning people without empathy is ableist? What do you say to someone who says, if you're damning people who cannot experience empathy, that's essentially ableism?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I want to emphasize here that I'm using empathy in a sense of like one's values, not in a sense of like a visceral experience that one experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a variety of different ways that you can use that term. So in this context, I'm using empathy in terms of one's motivations. And one can have empathetic impacts upon one's motivations without experiencing the visceral experience that is oftentimes called empathy, where you like directly feel yourself when you see someone in their shoes, right? So there are, for example, people who, and this gets back to like broader, like the meta ethics and the broader arguments as to like, why do good motivations emerge at all, right? And I can write great volumes on that. I'm not necessarily sure that that wouldn't take us wildly off topic. I have a piece that is a little bit thick in the weeds in terms of formal language and kind of jumping between Hume and AI and all sorts of stuff. But it's called The Orthogonality Thesis in Ontological Crises. And you can kind of tell by the name that it already is kind of thick in the weeds in terms of vernacular and stuff. But I try to go in there how I think that like empathy in some ways is an emergent tendency. And I think that the people who are oftentimes described as having no empathy oftentimes do have that empathy. So, for example, there's a deeply ableist charge against autistic people that they do not have empathy. But of course, autistic people, many, do feel empathy. It just is expressed and internalized in different ways. And we might call that empathy the visceral, like visceral empathy for other people. But then there are other people who don't feel visceral empathy at all, but who have kind of more of a rational enlightenment towards care for other people. That doesn't boil down to, I do good for other people in a tit for tat way that I expect them to do good for me, but in a more abstract kind of like, I see myself in other people and I want to maximize their capacity for choice, their creativeness, their like freedom in much the same way that I want to maximize mine, because I see the difference between the two of us as intellectually arbitrary. And that much more dry or intellectualized or rationalist kind of like form of empathy doesn't have to come with a visceral, like charged biological mirror neuron kind of firing kind of like dynamic. But it's sufficient to meet the usage of empathy that I was using in this context.
All right. You describe how, quote, cancel culture can be a useful way to handle bad people, and describe the canceling process as, quote, old-fashioned boycott dynamics supercharged by massive connectivity and the rapid progression of political, ethical discourse. And in response to canceling bad people, you discuss how the bad people might band together to maintain the status quo, and that it's actually difficult for them to do this because they're stifled by the stigmergic chaos of online altruists. And you wrote that bad people have a hard time acting in their common interest without a hierarchical system to handle coordinating them. Does this prove then that complexity ensures that the moral arc of history bends towards justice?
Well, I tend to not use the term justice, but broadly getting what you're talking about there, I would say that it's not quite so simple. It's encouraging in some regards, but it's an important caveat, and one that I try to emphasize several times in the piece Bad People, that while there are asymmetries in boycott dynamics, and those asymmetries basically boil down to whether or not you're willing to self-sacrifice, right? Like lots of people will pour in like hyenas to attack someone who they see as a weak target, or, for public scorn or something along those lines. Like there's definitely like, let's cancel this person for being uncool, or for any number of other things, or for a bullshit moral slight or a real moral slight or whatever, where a bunch of people like hyenas will descend upon them just for the personal benefit that it provides of like, being seen as slightly a, better person for dunking on a bad take, or for, gaining pleasure from the maliciousness or the sadism of shaming and attacking someone, or getting something, blackmailing someone, getting something out of them, whatever. There's definitely plenty of those dynamics. But there's an asymmetry around whether or not you're willing to self-sacrifice in that way. Most of the people who descend upon those kinds of things are not willing to self-sacrifice. So if you have two groups of people, one that is like, you know, one example is like Antifa versus like anti-Antifa and say like the metal scene, right? So you have like a band like Death in June or something that is fully a fascist band. Band members donate fucking money to fascists, to full out fascist organizations, band liner notes. Like there's all these connections, all this stuff. Like it's a fascist band. But, you know, there's at least some level of pretense or some level of, well, but we're gay. How could we possibly be fascist and gay? Isn't that a contradiction? Kind of like dynamic that's going on. And there's a bunch of people that are invested in like the coolness or the like whatever that are pro Death in June. And those individuals might be like scene gatekeepers or people who are invested in a certain amount of established like power, a certain established way of doing things within the scene. They're invested in like the edgelording it up of like, you know, what it means to be in this music scene is that we're all a bunch of edgelords and you can't, and no one can ever be like, you know, what it's great to actually say like fucked up shit about like raping women for sport because that just means that you're hard and like, you know, and super badass or whatever, or even worse things about like raping, murdering children or whatever. Like this just goes to show how you're like free from Christian like bullshit. So those people have a certain orientation and a certain thing that they're willing to like boycott other individuals for violating, right? So like somebody says like, hey, actually I think it's kind of fucked up that y'all are standing Death in June, which is like a fascist band. And so those individuals are going to come together and try to boycott the individual who is anti-Death in June, right? The anti-Antifa folks are going to try to boycott and aggressively shame and push out the Antifa folks because they see them as an existential threat or as outsiders or as like, you know, just a threat to their power and the established dynamics of the scene. Then you have the Antifa folks who are like, holy fucking shit, though, like Nazis. Like, this is a situation of actual fact. Like, you know, there's what are the consequences of letting this kind of stuff go unchecked, of letting Death in June recruit and have like, you know, tables and like have events, and what are the consequences of having this, of having these people get coordinated and organized? We have to stop them. And those two teams are going to clash, right? And they're going to try to boycott the other team. They're going to try to push the other team out, make the other team look really uncool, have consequences for the other team. But there is an asymmetry that emerges over how much individuals within each tendency are willing to actually sacrifice. And those that are anti-Antifa in this case are not motivated by altruism, compassion, empathy for other people. They are motivated purely by trying to preserve their own personal power and their own personal, like the norms, the scene that has been conducive to them being predatory or whatever the case is, right? Getting away with shit. Not having to worry about like the ethics of certain statements that you make, whatever the thing is. They want to preserve that, but that's purely from like a self-motivation. And they coalesce with other people who are self-motivated and they form a coalition with them. The anti-Antifa coalition, as the case may be. But those people, when push comes to shove, they fall apart. Whereas not all, but some of the individuals in the anti-fascist coalition or the anti-Death in June or whatever the band is or whatever the fucked up thing is, coalition, it's going to attract people who actually care about other people. And when you actually care about other people and you see in game theoretic terms their success as something of like your success, your payoff matrix is such that like the freedom of other people is in some sense also your freedom, and you're fighting to maximize freedom as a whole, not just your own personal freedom, you're willing to sacrifice and you're willing to like be really, really hated and, you know, vilified, attacked, have your house get firebombed, your windows broken, your dog shot, you know, get jumped on the streets, etc. The sort of things that many people that I know have actually had happen to them. And you're willing to make those sacrifices again and again and again. You win, kind of, sort of, statistically speaking, because you're able to punch harder and coordinate better and handle collective action problems in a way that the coalition of selfish individuals is not able to do. So your coalition ultimately kind of ekes out a winning, But the caveats that I've tried to emphasize repeatedly within the article is that this applies to anyone who has a payoff matrix that involves self-sacrifice. And that includes people who do not have necessarily things that you and I would consider to be moral. So there are Christians, for example, who will self-sacrifice to prevent abortion, right? There are people even who are like such twisted former husks of human beings, have become such like warped, like zombies of like, of fascism or whatever, that they are willing to sacrifice their lives for fascism. Now, there tends to be a little bit of an asymmetry there in terms of self-sacrifice, where it's pretty easy to give your life all at once. It's a lot harder to give your life little bit by little bit every day, day after day. So you find a lot of fascists looking for the ego boost or the payoff of becoming, famous as a martyr or something along those lines, Bull Patrol, whatever, that they're going to go out shooting and killing all the people who have wronged them, or shooting up a Jewish daycare or whatever, and then they'll get themselves killed by cop or by whatever, or by people who mobilize against them. And those individuals, it's kind of rare that cops would actually shoot them, but you know what I mean. Those individuals...
Pretty sure they escorted Dylan Roof out of that fucking church.
Right, or like here in Portland, Jeremy Christian got he held like the knife at them, and they like had a long conversation with him in the parking lot, and eventually, let's go get a burger, like that kind of stuff, right? Like, yeah. We'll go through excruciating, because like knows like, and the cops know ultimately that they're the same kind of people as like the Dylan Roofs, the Jeremy Christians. It's wild. Jeremy Christian, after he stabbed all those people on the max, he ran across the front lawn of my friend.
What?
Yeah, and I used to go to her house like every week.
Damn.
Like, yeah. Anyway, there's a lot of that shit struck so close to home. There were a lot of I would even on that max at almost the same bus stop, like a month and a half or some odd time before, there had been somebody else shouting racist shit at two girls, at two girls, and I was on a max with them, and I intervened, and probably didn't intervene as strongly as I should have in retrospect, and I feel a lot of like shame around not having stood up more prolifically, just kind of like put my body in the way, kind of like stared down the individual, but I feel a lot of shame about like having not done as much as other folks did on the max with Jeremy Christian. And also I feel a lot of like deep, that kind of survivor's resonance, like horror about like, God, that could have been me. Because that shit was just so like, anyway, it's like the same fucking max. It was the exact same like line.
Damn. Yeah.
We were coming out of downtown. Anyway, it's just so fucking creepy. But yeah, so like the cops, you have the killers or whatever, and you have individuals who are willing to like give their life all at once, and some dramatic display of, martyrdom. But typically the asymmetries, even in those cases, tend to play out of like, are you willing to do the incredibly painful work day after day after day where you don't get credit for it? And if you look at like many anti-fascist activists, not the new crop of like Twitter, academics and whatever sort of like, self-famed people, but the people who do this stuff completely anonymously, who are like carpenters or dentists or teachers or, baristas or whatever, who do the work in and out completely anonymously and oftentimes do a lot better work than the rest. Those individuals will never get credit. And if they ever get caught, they're the people who are actually going to be targeted for murder. They're the people who like, somebody finds out one of them and that person has to be like really bundled away and hidden because like, actual attacks upon their house, actual attacks, like the attempts, recently the killings in Colorado, etc. Like there are lots of instances where individuals will face a lot of repercussions from fascists at a very high level. And those individuals who are doing the work today in whatever capacity, knowing that that's at stake and also getting no benefit, no praise, no publicity, no payoff in any way, personally, those individuals are able to do quite a lot of damage against fascists because they're willing to make those personal sacrifices. So I think that personal sacrifice thing can cut obviously in our direction, but it also cuts in the direction of, say, individuals who are willing to, give their lives to, even incrementally, not just all at once, to constrain the right of women to have choice in their and have bodily autonomy. There's people who are true believers in a lot of different directions that are not correct, and that are not, as you put it, just, as I would put it, ethical. So I don't think that the overall arc of the universe bends towards justice through this means, but I do think that it provides us with a place where we have some strength.
Okay, yeah. So obviously this piece was originally published at C4SS, and then the Anarchist Library also published it, and a different outlet actually wrote a response piece to your article. I'm not sure whether or not you've read through it or how aware you are of the details in it. But one of the things they said in the piece in response to something you said was, how can an anarchist thinker end up believing in definitive hierarchies of intrinsic human value, or pondering on how the anarchist elite might cleanse society from bad people and still call that anarchism?
Yeah, I think I know the piece, and the individual in question, I think, has a blog where he rants constantly about having been banished for having been an abuser from anarchist spaces. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really silly things in that piece. And one of my favorite parts of because he's done several rants about the piece and about me. One of my favorite things he's he just says it. They admit it. It's right there. They admit it. And I'm like, yeah, no one was hiding this. But I don't know why you thought. So there does seem to be this gulf in terms of people come to anarchism for a variety of different things. And I think some people come to anarchism kind of ultimately intending to get away personally with some shit, and don't realize that other people come to it for very different reasons. And there are quite a lot of other people for reasons that may not align with yours. And a great deal of us are in that self-sacrifice, trying to marginalize and shut down the people who want to hurt other people. And, running out abusers, marginalizing them, boycotting them, canceling them, whatever. These are not perfect solutions, right? They are in many ways stopgap measures that we have in place, the least bad alternatives that are available to us. And obviously there are more ideal situations where somebody does harm and it's not baked into that person inherently, right? That person is not a serial abuser. I know people who, actually some of the best people that I know, I would say, not, I know many other people have never heard a fly in their lives, but some of the best people I know have fucked up rather significantly, once in their life. Or oh, actually I had sex with a number of people and it was off condom and I didn't inform them about STDs. I was young. I was a dumb punk. I didn't really know any better. Now I know a lot better. And now I've gone through restitution and that kind of thing. And so I know I know a couple of people who had that kind of history. And then another person who that person would be I one time in bed with a partner, well, both of us were really drunk because I had an alcoholic problem back then. We were having kinky sex and I didn't respect boundaries the way that I should have. And that person, actually, there's a number of people like that, but it's a recuperation or rehabilitation, cycle on that is pretty straightforward. That person quit alcohol for several years. That person made sure that, there were people who would check in on them. That person informed anybody that they were going to date, or they didn't go to certain events and certain things that they were asked not to go to by the people who had suffered harm on their account. Those people diligently did what they could to repair and, make the survivors feel safe again, a variety of different things. And also work on what were the frames of minds, the default, the heuristics, the habits that they themselves had fallen into. What were perhaps even the clashes of internal values, because you might have one value that cuts in one direction and another value that cuts in another direction. And in a moment of weakness, one value triumphs over the other value. And what you really need to do is take a rational depth, or look at yourself at length and come to terms and really shake things out in terms of your values and come to fully consciously at a deep level recognize I don't actually the one value trumps the other value, and the other value just needs to die, right? There are definitely spaces and ways in which people can adapt and change and grow and become better people. But when it's pretty clear that they are not going to, when, accountability is a waste of time for, survivors, their advocates, broader people in the community, when person is just mouthing words and doesn't really, just trying to lie and get by. And then once again is predatory, once again does some incredibly fucked up thing, puts their partner in the hospital, does it several times, right? When there's that kind of thing, the rehabilitation rates are so fucking low, and like even with the most advanced, progressive, lefty, enlightened, anarchisty, like, career therapist or social worker or whatever, collective that has been like, doing this kind of work for a long time, whatever the actor or the person involved did it, you can still be like, even that group or that thing wouldn't be able, like, their rate of success with people like you is so incredibly low that we, as a bunch of like random people who happen to know you or know the survivor, the odds of us being successful at stopping you from doing harm, and like, we can maybe make you afraid. We can maybe make you afraid of consequences, but to change your values, to change your strategies, even, maybe so hard and so unlikely to succeed that after we've put some time into it or whatever, or we've noted that you just continually recommit, there's mouth the words and then go right back and rape again. Like, it's not worth the rest of our lives being dedicated to poorly trying to hold you to account. We just have to make you like afraid, right? We have to like in some way stop you from doing the harm, make you feel that there are consequences. And the lightest touch that anarchists can have of consequences, and the consequences that are most in keeping with freedom of association, personal like agency, choice, deliberation in terms of who you associate with, in terms of the risk assessment and the value assessment you place upon others in terms of who they associate with, that kind of thing. The thing that's most in keeping with anarchist values is freedom, is boycott kind of dynamics there. It's the softest touch that we can have. It doesn't involve somebody being like, okay, you put multiple partners in the hospital multiple times, you like lie and prevaricate and do all this kind of shit in accountability processes. We're just going to beat you and like put you in the hospital and like break all your legs and let you know that if you ever do it again, we're going to do it even worse to you. Like, that's an approach. And there are definitely situations where that's the least bad option. But I think the option most in keeping with anarchist values, or the option that like is the least harmful in many cases, is simply applying the pressure of social sanction. You're not allowed in this show, bro. Right? You're like, we're not going to let you do this thing anymore. We're not, if you show up at a thing, we find you at a bar, we're going to make a fuss. We're going to tell people correctly the truth about what you've done. We're going to make you wear that fucking scarlet letter and bring you, if not to some degree of like concern for the consequences of the sheep that you are preying upon, at least make it so that people are aware of the danger that you represent, and you can't prey. You are not allowed access to certain spaces, and you're not, insofar as you try to like coordinate or collaborate with other people to organize, I don't know, a printing press for rapists, right? That's not such a hypothetical. Probably the most infamous example of this is like Jim Goat, who made a bunch of like pro-rape scenes in the punk scene in the early 90s. But like, we have to like find some way to like ostracize you and coordinate that boycott, not just in the sense of like making it another city's problem or another community's problem, but make it so that like people are informed about the threat that you represent. And so people can coordinate as a whole to sanction you, to make sure clear to other people who are onlooking that they're not going to, that the consequences of this are going to be pretty fucking negative if you do the same thing, but also through that sanction to free people from the risk and the danger that you pose to them. So that's something that I think is pretty naturally emergent, is probably the best anarchist approach, and all these the things that is most like consistent with anarchist values, that maximizes freedom for everyone as best as we can. Is not to say that every boycott is of course good. It's simply that boycotts are a good strategy among the toolbox, and for individuals who are motivated in the correct way or share the common values of anarchists, boycotts are oftentimes a good tool. And so the piece, so the line, would you say like intrinsic human value and definitive hierarchies? I don't think that like there are it's important to tease apart two different things here, right? So like there's this notion of like this thing is baked into you as your essence, this magical, platonic kind of like you're a bad person at core. And I don't really think that people are anything at core, right? I think that like they're shifting tendencies, and I think that people also, as they grow up or as they experience certain things, adapt and respond to those in complex ways and unpredictable ways. And that's part of the reason why like bad people will never be fully free of such people, even the most like utopian world where every kid gets every like possible like benefit and kindness and experience and, you know, whatever that they could have growing up. I think that there will still be people who like look through the set of strategies kind of like in this kind of like naive kind of way that kind of feel out the different strategies and different values they could have, be different people at different times, feel out, and sometimes they'll randomly get a little bit of success in one thing and they'll get a little bit more locked in that habit or that like line of thought or that way of being, and then get a little bit more locked and get a little bit more locked. And we can also look at like how game theoretically oftentimes like stable populations involve different sets of people in different proportions exercising different strategies. So you can have a population that's 99% punish the selfish dickbag people, and then have like 1% of the population that somehow persists because in small number they can sometimes hide among the sheep, right, and pretend as though they're one of them. And we definitely see people who, you know, like mouth a lot of words about social justice and about like accountability and anti-rape and whatever, and then turn out to be massive fucking rapists or massive predators or like all kinds of different stuff. We definitely seen plenty of places where people try to, you know, the wolves try to hide among the sheep and take advantage of certain things for as long as they can. Although usually, inevitably, eventually, their game comes crashing down. But so there's this notion of essence there in terms of like inherency. And just because and I want to emphasize that just because someone is unlikely to change, incredibly unlikely to change, like ridiculously unlikely to change, doesn't mean that they're inherently one way, right? But this notion of like hierarchy of value to people, I think there is a hierarchy of values in the sense that like having some values are better than having some other values. And that's what being an anarchist is, right? Like I'm sick and tired of the standard like hippie nihilist like response that I have gotten over the course of my life in anarchist spaces, although usually at like fringe kind of things, like Funa bombs or, you know, like shitty fucking like house shows or whatever, where you hear somebody basically being like, you know, it's almost the drill tweet, liking good things and bad things. There's no difference between them. The wise man solemnly hung his head. But more specifically, there's this tension or this thing where it's like, if you prefer one thing to another thing, if you value one thing over another thing, that's creating a hierarchy. And I think if we value like anything, if we as anarchists value anything, there is inherently going to be people who value that thing and people who don't value that thing. Mm-hmm. Like you value like genocide, or you value not genocide over genocide. How dare you? How un-anarchist, right? Like it's so silly. And like, of course we are going to think a genocideer sucks and is a bad person. Like, you know, I chose the word bad people, or I chose the phrase bad people specifically in order to kind of like provoke this kind of reaction from the hippie nihilist side because you can't say that there are people who are bad. Oh my God, that's so essentialist. Like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, there are people that suck. Like, and that are suck in like a really harmful, like dangerous way that we're not going to be able to do anything to change. And we need to be able to like come to terms with that and like address that and engage with that and have solutions to that don't look like genocide. Because my solution is not let's round up somehow identify, you know, right? I mean, we can identify everyone who has a badge on, right? But like, that wouldn't, you know, genocide would not be good. But even then, like if you genocided like the 700,000 or like democided, I guess, because they're not like erased, but like if you mass murdered 700,000 people in the United States alone, not counting the number of the millions of cops there are worldwide, like that wouldn't solve the fucking problem. There's still tons of would-be cops. Every fucking like social worker at a food stamps office, every Karen who's like, I have absolute power in my role. I can like deny you. I can make you come crawling on your belly. I can like whatever. Every single person like that person's going to be a new fucking like, you know, they're going to try to leverage the brutality and the control and the domination the same way that the cops did. Like there's so many would-be cops. Like, I don't know. I grew up in the projects. Like I knew tons of people who, you know, sold drugs or did shitty stuff. Like, I mean, selling drugs isn't bad, but, you know, like did shitty stuff in the process of selling drugs. And, or, you know, were part of gangs that, you know, murdered people, right? A lot of those people like just suck and would themselves leap to be the dominant gang like the cops are. And like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, even in completely fancy, you know, erudite, like, oh, so civilized circles of like, I don't know, lib journalists or journalists are probably a bad example, but like whatever the fucking space is that you would think of like, oh, look at these like super civilized people who are above the fray of like those people. There's always some people among them in those spaces who are predatorial pieces of shit just out for themselves, who, you know, want to do harm to other people, or who are even sadists, and like their only real pleasure in life is harming other people, is like causing pain, causing misery, who have values exactly opposite of anarchist values. Like, I don't know what to tell you. They suck and we don't. And we should be able to admit that and operate. And if we can't admit that, if we can't manage to like just recognize that inherently we have a moralizing position, we have a moral value, right? We don't have any fucking value then. We don't have any. Anarchism is just like, I don't know, a space for people to like say novel edgelord shit and like prey upon one another. I mean, like, I fail to understand what somebody could think anarchism could be if we don't think that we're better than some other people, right? Like, that our values are in some sense better. This isn't to say that we're angels. Like, we all have things to work on. We all have spaces for improvement and growth. Anarchism is all about trying to like drill into our own psyches, our own habits, our own, you know, norms and behaviors and strategies for engaging with the world, and find what's, you know, find places where we can grow, find places where we hadn't previously identified that like something could be problematic, and like ferret out new ways of existing and put those into practice in prefigurative spaces and collaboration with one another, and, you know, find ways of resistance that are actually successful so that we can catalyze and like stop like the people who suck from doing the harm that sucks. And I don't know, like I am a hardline individualist, but not an egoist, right? Like, I'm an altruistic individualist. And what that means is that, like, I think we should have an individual level analysis of a lot of things. I think also that individual level organizing is oftentimes really more efficient than like big mass organizations and trying to build like the party, the revolution, the get as many numbers as people in our ranks as possible. I think that the Anarchist Project is a lot more individual than that. I think it's about like building alternative ways of relating to one another, alternative ways of like solving problems, and finding things that individuals can do that can catalyze with one another into macro scale impacts. We're not majoritarians. We're not Democrats. We're not like trying to dominate the entire world with a party minority, right? We're not trying to like, you know, rule the world as a small number of people. But I think that when individuals are willing to sacrifice and put their lives on the line, and that catalyzes with other individuals who are willing to sacrifice a lot, and not just their life in one big attack upon, you know, in a showy explosions and gunfire, hail of bullets, but sacrifice their life every day, a little bit by little bit, caring and giving to others, you know, and taking time and living and having joy. And, you know, I'm not suggesting that the asceticism or anything is necessarily good in and of itself in any real way, but like, you know, there's plenty of space. We're anarchists. We still have to like find space for novelty and creativity and originality and choice and agency in our own lives. And that means a little bit of play and joy and all the other things. But like, we do give for one another. We do sacrifice for one another. The Anarchist Project is always involved, like shooting Freck or, you know, stabbing, president, whatever there has always been that element of sacrifice in the Anarchist Project.
Yeah.
There's always been that.
Sometimes they overlap, sacrifice and fun.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, sure. Right. And there's always kind of been those dynamics and stuff. And that doesn't make us like an oppressive Leninist, like cadre trying to rule the world. It's far more dynamic and fluid and on the fly and individually driven and bottom up. But we are a minority. Like, we are a minority. We've always been a minority, and we will probably always be a minority. We may not, someday we may be something of a majority, but we will always be like not everyone, which means that there will always be some actors and some people out there that like have interests aligned against us. And being able to say, like, it's not just structural dynamics that we're opposing. We're opposing ways of thinking about the world, strategies of engagement with the world. If we were simply opposed to structural dynamics like the Marxists, and we were just like opposed to patriarchy, opposed to the state, opposed to capitalism, opposed to these like specific structural macroscopic dynamics that we can name, identify, see how they like, recongeal and like self-reinforce. If we were just opposed to those, we'd knock them down and then immediately reproduce completely new ones, right? We'd reproduce completely new forms of hierarchy and domination that didn't fit the structural dynamics and the exact characteristics of the things that we had identified. There'd be some completely new one. What makes anarchists unique is precisely that we can try to like ferret out the consequences of the actions, try to find the best possible approaches in like every possible dynamic, in every possible situation, and address power and abuse and things at the root, at the individual level, and recognize how they rise from that, and how the bigger structures, the bigger dynamics, the things like institutional policing, the prison system, all this stuff is predicated upon, in part, not just in part, not just alone, there are other dynamics, is predicated upon the individual or emergent individual tendencies in terms of value, in terms of strategy, in terms of habit, norms, all these different things. And we're trying to like engage with those, not just in our own lives, but also recognize them and the consequences of those dynamics in other people around us. So yeah, I mean, I think the Anarchist Project is a bottom-up project that takes place in a variety of ways, and inherently it's going to mean making a decision in situations that, like, I don't know, I think that like the dude who has beat 5 fucking partners in a row and ducked through 3 fucking accountability processes and shows all the like performative remorse in the world, but doesn't fucking change his behavior. I think that person is just motivated by bad shit. I think that person can read all the bell hooks like books and the like consent 101 zines like he fucking lied, or we try to push on him. He's not going to change what his values are. He's just going to try to hide how he, and not get caught. And recognizing the core motivations of that person is just practical and not being a fool. And once we recognize the motivations of that person, we know that there is no amount of text we're going to give that person in a reasonable period of time that will make that person, or that will persuade that person necessarily. I hold out hope that there's always some infinitesimal chance or some small chance, but it's just not the cost benefit ratio. Like, it just doesn't pan out in terms of like sacrificing the lives of so many other people in the community who could be doing things to like resist the state, who could be doing things to resist all these other forms of oppression, but are stuck handling the fact that like 5 of their fucking friends are terrified to go into spaces with this dude, right? And this dude continues to be a predator. Like, what are you going to do? You have to just make that dude like have consequences. And yeah, if that means that we've created some sort of definitive hierarchy of intrinsic human values by saying that dude sucks, like, okay, sure, fine, whatever, who cares? My anarchism was never predicated upon those terms. My anarchism is about providing the greatest amount of freedom to people and to giving people more option in life and in choice. And the 5 fucking exes of his, much less all the people who are wasting their lives trying to hold him accountable on their behalf, and not to mention the people he's going to fucking abuse and, horribly beat in the future, like, all those people's freedoms come way before his freedom. So like, or his freedom to like go to shows and not face like people being like, hey bro, you suck. Right? Like, so okay, cool. There's a hierarchy of like shitbags suck and people who aren't shitbags are better than them. Yeah, you caught me. I don't know what to say to that critique beyond that. It's just so laughable. And I really think anyone who would take that kind of critique seriously just reveals that they're coming at things from a completely different perspective. Almost everyone that I would consider to be like an anarchist, or everyone that I organize with, or like am friends with, or live with, or like collaborate with, like what the fuck is even the point of anarchism if you're not gonna like, if you can't call out a shitbag and be like, you suck, right? Like, what is even the point of any of this? What if we just have to pass over in silence when a cop is beating a friend, right? Or like the moment the cop takes off the badge, we're like, oh, well, you're no longer part of a structural oppression, so I guess we can't really say anything about you. We can't say that that sucks and that you are going to be shitty probably no matter what, and given your history and your dynamics there. Like, we just have to pretend, magically believe in something that there's no evidence of one way or the other, that you're going to suddenly change despite the fact that you have repeatedly refused to. If anarchism equals like self-delusion like that, then I don't want anything to do with it, but I don't think that it does. I think that anarchism is about liberation, the liberation of all as best as we can, and sometimes that involves trade-offs, and I'm more than happy to make the trade-off of being like, some dudes suck.
Yeah. All right, well, I have one more question, which is actually a listener question, and then we can go to the actual end of our conversation here. All right, so the listener question unfortunately has almost nothing to do with everything or the article we've discussed today, but it's fun, so I figured we should keep it in anyways. So what do you think about the James Webb telescope?
That's an interesting question, because my father was an anarchist, and he came out of like the green anarchist and like Christian anarchist kind of like space, and he hated the Hubble telescope. And so I think it went up in the early 90s or something like that. Whatever the thing was, it was like in the news all the fucking time when I was a kid. And he would just rant about how much he hated space, how much he hated like space projects and NASA. He got scrubbed out of NASA. I mean, he was a chemical engineer, and he went back and forth. Like, he did other things, like he was like a paralegal for activists a bunch, but he constantly would go back because he had this chemical engineering degree. And so he went into NASA for a bit, and he alleged that he worked on some of the initial precursor designs of the Challenger project. And he alleged, and this is one of those spaces where I'm like, I don't know, old man, if I trust you on this, just because like he kind of took a tone with it where I'm like, unlike all the other activist projects where I can like dig up records of you, I don't really know about this one. But he alleged that he worked on like the breakaway. So in the space shuttle, there was supposed to be this way for like the tip of the shuttle, or like the cockpit or whatever, to break off and like emergency like bust off if shit went wrong, right? And he was like, in the Challenger disaster, I was right all along. Like, if they had done my thing, the astronauts could have just jumped off to safety. They erased the thing. They da. And I don't know how true that is. I mean, it wouldn't fucking surprise me. I mean, like, national bureaucratic shit, fuck NASA, etc. Like, cutting corners, putting people's lives on hand. Totally shit that institutions do. I also just don't know if that was true. But it left him with such a sour taste in his mouth that he like went hard line, especially in like the anti-nuclear, like green stuff of the 80s. He went like hard line green and was like, space is a complete waste of time. We should never go to space. And I think it's important to note, like, his green politics back then were really deeply tied to like Christian politics as a whole. So like, who was doing like the anti-nuclear stuff? Well, it was like Quaker organizing, and it was people who were using like consensus process out of like Christian anarchist kind of spaces, or like or Christian spaces. And there was a lot of like more, the green anarchism was kind of like a Christian anarchism in a lot of ways in terms of its like application, or I mean, wasn't necessarily true like Fifth Estate, but like it was true on the ground in like the ways that these like milieus were like converging. And so like, and this is also kind of like before like Freddie Perlman and wrote like Leviathan, and before like John Searson was really like a thing. And so like the main like kind of folks you were pulling shit from, if you were like an anarchist, was like Jack Zalul, and he was like a Christian anarchist, and his like green anarchism was deeply tied to Christian anarchism. And so my dad's kind of take was like, why should we care about anything beyond Earth? It doesn't make any sort of sense, because the perfection of the species or gradual enlightenment should happen entirely on Earth. We don't need technology for that. We should just like generation after generation improve our souls or something, or come closer to God or whatever. He was also influenced by Taylor Desjardins, other. We get into kind of his Jesuitly, like weird crossover Christian Catholic anarchism shit, but it's more esoteric theology for the sake of us. Anyway, so he was like really into that shit, and we would have arguments every weekend, and I'm like this 9-year-old, 10-year-old, like whatever kid, because originally I'd been pretty green. And then I was like, wait, this doesn't make any sense though. Why wouldn't we care about like the rest of the universe? Why like there's all this stuff out there. There's all this, I don't see any if there are other people out there, we should really it'd be so great. There's so many things we could learn from them. They could learn from us. But if there aren't other people, then these universes is this vast empty wasteland of dead shit. And like humanity could die tomorrow in the cradle over nothing. God doesn't exist. There's nothing protecting us from an asteroid hitting us all at once. Why should we not care about the rest of the universe? And the Hubble telescope is such a small little thing. You're just like, all you're doing is pulling up a single telescope. And it became this point of contention between the two of us, where he was like, what, telescopes on Earth aren't good enough? And I'm like, what really is the difference between like putting one up there and putting one down here, except in terms of what it can actually see? So I actually have like all of this like history, like years of my childhood fighting with my dad on this topic again and again and again. And suffice to say, I am pro James Webb telescope. I mean, we could get into the minutia and like, they could have done this instead of this and the technicalities and things along those lines. But for me personally, what I like about that question is it reminds me of that fight I would have every fucking weekend with my dad. So he's wrong. He's dead wrong. He's got no argument. There are no arguments that can be made. If you want to expand human freedom, that includes like our knowledge. We have to have a better map of reality in order to have choice in reality. And having a better map of reality involves having a better map of the universe as a whole. Yeah, so that's all I have to say on that.
Fuck you, Dad. We're going to space.
We're going to space, Dad, whether you like it or not. And we're going to power it by your spinning corpse.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, I liked him in many ways, but he was dead wrong on that.
All right. So what's the best way for listeners to follow you and your work, Will?
Well, so I have a website, humanarration.net. I also write for C4SS. Used to write for other outlets, but C4SS takes up a lot of that time. And oftentimes there are things that I publish only on my personal website, or that I publish only on C4SS, because they don't necessarily fit with either side of that. And I oftentimes give C4SS first run, so a piece will appear there before it appears on my website, oftentimes for a lot of things. But C4SS.org and humanitarians.net are generally the best places to read my writing.
Okay, cool. Well, is there anything I forgot to ask you about that you'd like to touch on before we end the interview?
No, I think we covered a lot of things. Thank you for letting me like ramble and rant and give extended anecdotes. I appreciate that. As always, it's nice to talk to you, Joel, and I love your podcast. So look forward to seeing more people on it.
Thank you. Well, that was flattering. It was fun hearing you ramble, and this conversation was great. I always like talking to you also. And thanks so much for joining me, and hopefully we will talk to you very soon.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Bye.